Hey guys, welcome back to Moonlight&Sleepless. Tonight we're stepping quietly into the warm silence of the Egyptian desert. Picture this, a soft breeze brushing across endless golden sand, the shadows of the pyramids stretching long under a sky dusted with stars. Somewhere far off, a camel bell rings lazily. But here, under this vast celestial dome, all you hear is the sound of history breathing. We're at Giza, standing before those three iconic pyramids, but tonight, we're not tourists. We're time travelers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. In the comments, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've probably seen them 1,000 times in textbooks, on postcards, maybe even from an airplane window, but standing right at the base of the Great Pyramid at night, that's something else entirely. It looms above you like a silent mountain, impossibly smooth and symmetrical, lit only by moonlight. And if you stand there long enough, something strange starts to happen. The night doesn't feel empty. It feels full, full of memory, full of questions, full of whispers you can't quite hear. That's when the real story begins, not the one about dusty tombs and mummies, but the one about stars. Because these pyramids, they're not just piles of stone. They're messages in a cosmic bottle. And someone thousands of years ago really wanted us to notice. It's funny how modern science used satellites and laser measurements to discover the pyramid's perfect alignment with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, like an ancient compass carved in limestone. But the ancients? They didn't have satellites. They had sky. They had patience. They watched. They recorded. And they built not randomly, not haphazardly, but with a kind of precision that still makes today's engineers squint in disbelief. Imagine being one of those workers, hauling limestone blocks by torchlight, the stars your only witness. And all the while, your overseer muttering, No, it's half a degree off. We need to realign with Orion. Like, dude, we're building in sand. Give us a break. But they didn't want breaks. They wanted forever. You can feel that when you look at the shape how it rises, calm and certain, as if trying to meet the sky halfway. The ancient Egyptians believed the heavens were a realm of gods, and the pharaohs? They weren't just rulers, they were stargazers in human form, destined to ascend. So why not build a staircase of stone? Something that pointed exactly where the soul needed to go? As we stand in the cool night, it's not hard to imagine a young apprentice, maybe 17, pausing to wipe sweat off his brow, then glancing up at the Milky Way. He's wondering why it matters that this block faces slightly more northeast. He doesn't know yet, but thousands of years later, someone will run a simulation on a supercomputer and realize it matches Orion's belt perfectly. Maybe he'd smile at that. Maybe he'd roll his eyes and say, "So what? I still have 12 more blocks to move." But here's the thing. For the ancient Egyptians, nothing was just anything. Nothing was just a stone. Nothing was just decoration. Everything had a purpose. Everything was part of the plan. And the plan? It reached all the way into the sky. We tend to think of ancient civilizations as primitive, like they were guessing their way through the dark. But no, These people could track the heliacal rising of Sirius, the exact day the star first appears before sunrise each year. They used it to time the Nile's flooding. That's not superstition. That's science wrapped in myth. That's sky watching turned into architecture. So maybe that's what we're really looking at tonight, not ruins, but a language, a conversation between Earth and cosmos. A message carved into stone and shadow, only visible to those who are willing to stand still under the stars and listen. Listen to the silence. Listen to the alignment. Listen to the way the pyramid never moves, but always points. And in that quiet, under the soft hum of starlight, you'll begin to wonder, if the pyramids were aligned with stars, what were they trying to reach? And why? The sand shifts under your feet, but the stones don't budge a knot after 4,000 years. That's the first thing that hits you. These pyramids weren't meant to fade. They weren't built to impress tourists. They were meant to last, and maybe to speak. Not in words, but in direction, in shape, in cosmic geometry. The desert is quiet, sure, but above us, the sky is very much alive. And once you start looking up with their eyes, nothing looks accidental anymore. Now imagine this. It's night, maybe 2500 BCE. A priest in long linen robes stands on a low platform, holding a simple wooden instrument. It's called a merkit, like a cross between a plumb line and a star pointer. He's watching the sky with deadly focus, tracking a single star, probably Thuban, which back then, not Polaris, was the North Star. He waits until that star passes the exact same point in the sky, night after night, marking north with nothing but a string, and the patience of someone who truly believes the stars are watching back. He doesn't see a sky. He sees a blueprint. And here's where it gets almost unsettling. The Great Pyramid is aligned within 3/60ths of a degree of true north. You can't even park a car that straight. Somehow, using wooden tools, no lenses, no steel, no GPS, they figured it out. Either they were absurdly lucky, or they knew something. Something we've forgotten. But why? Why so precise? Why so obsessed with orientation? Well, to the Egyptians, the earth and sky were reflections. The desert and the cosmos were not separate realms. They were mirrors. And if the pharaoh was to live forever, he had to be placed where heaven and earth matched. Enter the stars. Specifically, Orion. You've probably seen Orion's belt in winter 3 stars in a neat little row, angled like someone tied their sash in a hurry. The ancient Egyptians saw more than just stars. They saw Osiris, god of death and rebirth, the original celestial ruler. His soul, they believed, was Orion. And that meant pharaohs, as Osiris's successors, would want to be aligned with him, not metaphorically, literally. So let's walk a few steps out and look again at the layout of the 3 pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. You'd think they'd be lined up in a row, military style, but no. The smallest one is nudged off-center. Architects today might call it asymmetrical. Astronomers, they call it identical. Because if you map the 3 pyramids over Orion's belt, guess what? They match. In angle, in spacing, in boldness. Even their brightness roughly corresponds to the star's luminosity. Coincidence? Sure, maybe. But maybe not. Imagine you're that same teenage apprentice from before, now promoted, now a grown man with gray at his temples. You helped lay those stones. You never got the credit. But years later, you lie in the sand, looking up at Orion again, and something clicks. The thing you built, it mirrors the thing you see. And for the first time, you feel eternal. We could dismiss it, of course, say it's myth, say it's artistic. But then, how do you explain the shaft? Inside the Great Pyramid, deep in the king's chamber, there's a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for a hand to reach through. It leads nowhere. It's not for air. It's angled at 45 degrees. And back in the day, if you stood there at a certain moment in the year and looked up through it, you'd see Orion. They built the pyramid to look at that star, or maybe to launch toward it. This wasn't just architecture. It was spiritual astrophysics. Stone as prayer, geometry as theology, and at the heart of it, alignment, as if saying, if I point myself right, I'll find my way home. Whether that's the afterlife or the stars, who knows? But it's moving, isn't it? That's the second thing that hits you. The more you understand, the quieter you get. Because deep down, the desert isn't silent. It's just waiting for you to start listening differently. And once you start, you'll find yourself asking, did these ancient architects build for pharaohs or for gods? The stars hang lower now, or maybe it's just your imagination. After a while, this place starts to play tricks on your sense of space, of time, of reality. You sit in the sand near the Great Pyramid and feel small not in a sad way, but in that beautiful goosebump way that reminds you the universe is so much bigger than your calendar. And then, as your eyes drift upward again, you wonder, what kind of person decides to speak to the stars using stone? Let's talk pharaohs. Not just golden masks and crocodile gods, but real men with very real ambitions and just a tiny obsession with eternity. See, when Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid, came into power, he didn't just want a nice tomb with some murals and a few offerings. He wanted to ascend. Literally. The pyramid wasn't a grave. It was a launch pad. The ancient Egyptians believed the pharaoh's soul would rise to the heavens after death, specifically to the imperishable stars, those that never set, circling endlessly around the North Pole. You know them today as the circumpolar stars, and to get there, the soul needed a kind of celestial GPS. That's where the alignment comes in, because these people weren't just building fancy mausoleums. They were building vehicles. And you can almost see it, can't you? The royal court gathered under a darkening sky, watching the priests perform rituals beside the nearly finished pyramid. Incense swirling, torches flickering, the air full of purpose and sand, and over them stars rotating with slow, divine patience. The pharaoh himself silent on a throne, knowing that after his death, the journey would begin it to a paradise, but to a very specific location in the sky. Khufu wasn't alone in this thinking. His son, Khafre, and grandson, Menkaure, followed the same stellar blueprint. But here's where things get interesting. This wasn't just personal legacy. It was a cosmic hierarchy. The pharaohs saw themselves as earthly reflections of celestial gods. Osiris, ruler of the afterlife, was up there in Orion. Horus, the sky god, was flying above them as a falcon, and Ra, the sun god, made his journey across the heavens every day. If you wanted to join that divine circuit, you had to be in the right spot, preferably in a monument that could channel your soul like a beacon. And the people? They went along with it, not because they were forced, but because it made sense. When the Nile flooded, it came right after Sirius, brightest star in the sky, reappeared in dawn's light. Stars weren't decoration. They were calendar, compass, clock, and scripture all in one. So if a pharaoh said, "Build me a pathway to Orion," who was going to argue? But here's the twist. The pharaohs weren't trying to escape Earth. They were trying to anchor heaven, to bring the cosmic Order Ma'at, as they called it, down to the dirt and sand, to freeze the stars into stone. And that's why the alignment mattered. Because if your pyramid pointed wrong, your soul might wander. If your orientation was off, your place in eternity could vanish. Imagine the pressure on the architect. Hey, Imhotep, no stress. But if you miscalculate by a degree, the king's spirit might get lost in deep space forever. Sleep well. Some scholars today argue it was symbolic. Others say it was spiritual science or political theater, or both. But when you look at the way the shafts point to Orion and Sirius, the way the pyramids mirror the stars, it feels like more than metaphor. It feels deliberate, like someone trying to write a message to the universe in a language made of angles and intentions. And tonight, standing here, you begin to feel what the pharaohs might have felt. That humbling thrill of aligning yourself with something ancient and vast. That quiet desire to be more than a name on a wall. To be remembered not just by people, but by the stars themselves. You stare up again. Orion twinkles back. And for a moment, you wonder, was that their goal all along? Not to rule forever, just to be seen from above. If you lie back now, right in the sand, and trace Orion's belt with your eyes, you'll start to feel it, the eerie symmetry. The three stars aren't spaced evenly, and neither are the pyramids. That offset, that little shift in Menkar's position, it used to bother people. Architects hated it. Engineers shook their heads. But astronomers, they smiled. Because in the sky, those three stars sit in that exact same skewed line. And it's not random. It's a signature, a design, a cosmic fingerprint etched into the desert. Now imagine what that must have felt like back then. You're part of the royal crew. You've spent years, maybe decades, stacking stones, measuring angles, praying to not get crushed under a 2.5-ton block. Then one night, a priest brings you to the top of the pyramid scaffolding, and he points to the sky. "There," he whispers. "Now look down." And for the first time, you see it. The same pattern above is the pattern below. It's not just art. It's not just math. It's alignment with meaning. This is where the Orion correlation theory comes, in a modern term for what the ancients might have simply called destiny. The theory suggests the layout of the three main pyramids of Giza is a deliberate replica of Orion's belt. Not just in shape, but in proportion. The brightness of each star matches the relative size of each pyramid. Khufu, the Great Pyramid, lines up with Alnitak, the brightest. Khafre links with Al-Nilam. Menkaure, smaller, fainter, corresponds with Mintaka. Ancient architecture matching stellar magnitude? That's not luck. That's obsession. But here's where it gets deliciously complicated. Some skeptics scoff, of course. They say we're reading too much into it. Projection. Apophenia. The human brain's need to find patterns. And sure, that's possible, but that assumes the Egyptians weren't capable of intentional astronomical design. That's like looking at a clock and saying, it's probably just random dots, number. This clock ticks with starlight. Even more compelling? The placement of the pyramids only perfectly matches Orion's belt if you rewind the sky. See, due to a phenomenon called precession, the stars slowly shift over thousands of years. The alignment we see today doesn't quite match. But roll the sky back, say, to around 10,500 BCE and suddenly, boom, exact match. That's way before the pyramids were supposedly built. But why would the design reflect that ancient sky? That question opens a whole sandstorm of theories. Did the Egyptians inherit knowledge from an even older civilization? Was this part of a preserved, star-based calendar that extended back millennia? Or was it symbolic? A kind of return to the first time. What they called Zeptepia, mythical golden age, when gods ruled and the world aligned. No one knows for sure. And maybe that's the point. The pyramids weren't built to answer questions. They were built to outlast them, to keep people looking up and wondering. And let's be honest, when was the last time a building made you question the nature of time itself? But back to the desert. As you sit here, you can feel the weight of that connection, the chill of night, the warm stone behind you, the stars above like an old map that somehow leads forward. The pharaohs wanted to go to Orion. But maybe more than that, they wanted you to look there too. Maybe they knew that one day, maybe you would trace that same line from stone to star and feel the pull. That quiet invitation to imagine more. And just when your thoughts start to drift off, another idea sneaks in, soft as desert wind. If the pyramids align with Orion, what else out here might be pointing to something? What else beneath the sand is aimed at the stars? You brush a bit of sand off your sleeve, and for a second, you realize it could be ancient, like really ancient. Maybe it once filled the cracks between limestone blocks. Maybe it was stuck to a worker's sandal as he dragged his tired feet across the plateau. This place isn't just old, it's layered. Every grain holds a whisper. And the loudest ones? They don't come from kings or priests. They come from the builders. Let's stop for a moment and appreciate the absurd brilliance of what they did. Over 2 million blocks of stone, each one weighing somewhere between 2 and 15 tons, mined from quarries miles away, hauled by hand. No wheels, no cranes, no steel, just ropes, sweat, and that relentless drive to, what? Immortalize a man? Reach the stars? Anchor a nation? Whatever the reason, they did it with a level of coordination that would terrify modern project managers. And yet, beyond the scale and labor, what makes the pyramids so mesmerizing is their intentionality. Every measurement, every angle, every alignment, deliberate. These weren't just tombs. They were machines. Not in a mechanical sense, but in a symbolic one. Devices designed to interact with the cosmos. Some scholars believe they functioned as resurrection engines, portals. a kind of stony spacecraft for the soul. It sounds dramatic, I know. But think about the design. The Great Pyramid isn't just turrets proportionally perfect. The base perimeter divided by twice its height gives you a number startlingly close to pi. The ratio of its height to the base side corresponds to the golden ratio, and the orientation. It's aligned to true north more precisely than any modern building constructed before the late 19th century. All that from a civilization without iron tools. That's not a lucky guess. That's cosmic-level planning. Now, imagine being one of the architects. You're sketching plans not on blueprints, but in sand. You're using shadows, starlight, maybe even reflections in pools of water to measure the angle of celestial bodies. And someone, maybe a high priest, maybe the pharaoh himself, leans over and says, "Make it eternal." And somehow, you do. There's this idea among some Egyptologists that the pyramids were meant to be more than graves. They were meant to replicate the ancient concept of the duat, the underworld, but not in a creepy horror movie way. In Egyptian thought, the underworld wasn't a punishment zone. It was a place of transformation, rebirth, and passage. And the pyramid? It wasn't where a pharaoh went to die. It was where he went to become something more. That's why so much of the internal structure is symbolic. The ascending and descending passages, the king's chamber, the queen's chamber, the narrow shafts leading out to stars. You can't look at that layout and tell me they weren't mapping a journey, a passage from Earth to elsewhere, like boarding gates in a celestial airport. And just like any machine, the pyramid needed to be calibrated. That's where the stars came in. They weren't just inspiration, they were coordinates, aiming tools. The builders weren't just aligning with true north for fun, they were syncing their project with the rhythms of the heavens, as if to say, when the time comes, this structure will know where to send the soul. It's poetic and precise, a little mystical, a little mathematical. And standing here now, you can almost feel the ambition behind it all, not just to build something big, but to build something that meant something, that did something, that lasted not just through generations, but through epochs. You glance back at the towering blocks. They don't creak, they don't crumble. They just stand, watching, waiting, still aimed at the same stars as they were millennia ago. And maybe that's the most powerful part of all, that a bunch of humans, armed with copper chisels and dreams of eternity, actually succeeded. And now that you know this pyramid is more than a pyramid, another question starts to form, subtle but persistent. If this was a machine for a soul's journey, then where exactly was the final destination? You feel it more than you understand it, that low hum, not of sound but of purpose. The way each stone sits exactly where it should, the way the air inside the pyramid tunnels feels different, cooler, tighter, like time's breath has been sealed in there. It's not just a monument anymore. It's something alive. And now we're going to talk about the numbers. Not the dry, boring kind no spreadsheets here. We're talking sacred geometry. Sand-carved math that stares back at the stars. Let's start with a detail you probably wouldn't notice unless you measured and the ancient Egyptians definitely did. The sides of the Great Pyramid are just under 230.4 meters long, and the height was once about 146.6 meters. Doesn't sound dramatic. Watch this. If you take the perimeter of the base and divide it by twice the height, you get very nearly 1,416 pi. The same pi you last met in high school geometry, probably with a calculator and a frown. But these people had no calculators. And still, they got it. Then there's the golden ratio phi, that magical 1.618 number that shows up in seashells, sunflowers, and Renaissance paintings. The pyramid? It's got that too. The slope of each face forms a triangle that almost perfectly expresses the golden ratio between base and height. Coincidence? Again? Look, one coincidence is cute. Two is impressive. But a pyramid full of cosmic math? That's a statement. And these ratios weren't just aesthetic. They were functional. To the Egyptians, numbers weren't just tools. They were divine. The universe was built in numbers, and to imitate that divine order, you had to build with numbers too. Ma'at, their concept of universal balance, wasn't just philosophy. It was geometry. Your tomb better line up with the cosmos, or your soul might not know where to go next. But here's what really makes you sit up in the sand a little straighter. The pyramid's alignment. It's aligned to true north with an error of just 3 arc minutes. That's almost nothing. Modern compasses can be less accurate. How did they do that? The answer lies in the sky. They watch stars rise and set year after year, waiting for that perfect crossing point. Some say they used a method called the dual star technique, watching 2 stars on opposite sides of the sky rise and fall in sync, then marking the exact midpoint. Others think they built giant sight lines with poles and water basins to reflect the stars and find the meridian line. Either way, they didn't just aim north because it looked nice. They aimed north because that's where the imperishable stars circled. Stars like Kokab and Mizar that never dipped below the horizon. In their mythology, these were the stars that didn't die. So, if you wanted your soul to join the undying, well, better make sure your pyramid knew where those stars were. Now zoom in, deeper inside. The king's chamber, high up in the pyramid's body, is built with massive granite beams, some weighing 60 tons. No one really knows how they hauled them up there, but they did. And above the chamber, 5 layers of relieving chambers, each one a buffer zone to absorb pressure and keep the ceiling from collapsing. That's not guesswork, that's engineering. That's intention. And it all leads to a strange little passage about 20 centimeters wide, tilted at 45 degrees. Not for crawling through, not for decoration, for sight. One shaft points directly to Orion's belt. Another, Sirius, the dog star. And they weren't just eye candy. These stars were gods. Osiris, Isis, the divine couple, the mythological foundation of rebirth and eternity. The pyramid wasn't just pointing to stars. It was pointing to stories, their most sacred ones. And as the wind picks up slightly, carrying the scent of dust and something older, your eyes flick back to the stars. Suddenly, they don't feel so far away. The math, the stone, the stories, it all lines up, literally. And in the quiet, you wonder, if the pharaohs believed these stars were their destiny, could the pyramid be more than a destination? Could it be a departure point? The desert is still, but the stars aren't. They move slowly across the sky, not like cars on a road, but like whispers across time. And down here, tucked beneath them, lies something just as powerful as the pyramids themselves, the Nile. It curves through the land like a blue ribbon tossed across parchment. And to the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't just a river, it was a reflection. Because in their eyes, what flowed through Egypt was mirrored above by what flowed through the heavens. The Milky Way, that soft silver band stretching across the night. Today we think of it as poetic, romantic, almost decorative. But back then, it was sacred. They called it the celestial Nile River of Stars that mirrored their own. And just like the earthly Nile nourished the land, the celestial Nile was believed to nourish the soul. To them, everything came in pairs, above and below, earth and sky, river and galaxy. Now picture this. You're floating down the Nile at night in a reed boat. The water is dark but calm. On either side, torchlight flickers from distant temples, and above you, the stars glide quietly, their reflections dancing on the ripples. You don't need to wonder if they believed in cosmic connection. You can feel it. The symmetry, the flow, the harmony, it's overwhelming. That's why the positioning of the pyramids matters even more than you think. They weren't just aligned to stars in the sky. They were placed beside the earthly Nile to mimic the layout of the Milky Way. The pyramids on one side, the river on the other, just like Orion's belt, sits beside the hazy band of our galaxy. In their minds, the land was built to match the cosmos. That wasn't decoration. That was destiny. And it wasn't just the pyramids. Temples, tombs, entire city grids were planned with this duality in mind. To be out of alignment wasn't just an architectural mistake, it was a cosmic offense. It disrupted Ma'at, the sacred balance that kept the universe from slipping into chaos. Imagine believing that one misaligned block could throw off your afterlife. That's pressure. That's reverence. That's obsession. There's also this subtle poetry in how the Nile itself flowed from south to north, upward, in our modern map spot to the Egyptians. It flowed down from the source of creation. From the mountains of the south, the Nile delivered life to the delta, like a divine vein pumping sustenance into the body of the land. And above it, the Milky Way flowed in reverse, from north to south, as if the two rivers were in eternal conversation, never touching, but always echoing each other. So, when the pharaohs built their pyramids on the west bank of the Nile land of the setting sun, the symbolic realm of the dead, they weren't just thinking about property value. They were positioning themselves in the perfect spot to cross from this life to the next, from river to sky, from body to soul. Even the tomb texts speak of celestial ferries, of boats that carry the pharaoh's spirit across the sky, navigating the Milky Way as if it were a second Nile. Osiris, the god of the dead, sailed that route before them. The pyramid texts even describe starry waters and heavenly canals. This wasn't myth as metaphor. This was travel planning. Step-by-step instructions for getting from dead to divine. And it all starts with placement, with choosing just the right patch of desert, with making sure the stone face reflects the star face, with ensuring that when the soul looks up, it sees its path mirrored exactly. As above, so below. Lying here now, with the stars gliding over your head and the sand cooling under your body, you start to feel the beauty of it all. That they didn't build for now, they built for forever. That even as the Nile shifted course and empires rose and fell, the pyramids and the stars still spoke to each other, whispering across eternity. And if you're really quiet, you might just hear it too. The voice of water, the hush of stars, the soft promise that every soul, if placed just right, will always find its way home. It's not the brightest star in the sky, but when Sirius rises, everything changes. Long before digital calendars and weather apps, the ancient Egyptians waited for one thing to tell them the year had truly begun: the return of Sirius at dawn. Just before sunrise, for one brief, shimmering moment, the star would pierce the horizon, glowing like a divine eye. And when it did, they knew the Nile was coming back to life. To modern astronomy, that's called the heliacal rising of Sirius. To ancient Egypt, it was an event of mythic power. It wasn't just a star reappearing, it was a goddess awakening. Sirius was Isis, brilliant, loyal, mourning her lost husband Osiris and guiding his soul home. Her reappearance in the sky each year wasn't coincidence, it was ritual. It was resurrection. And the pyramids? They were timed, shaped, and aimed to catch that rising light like a sacred signal. Imagine a priest, high atop a temple platform, peering into the eastern sky in early July. He's been waiting all night, the horizon still black, the air heavy with silence. Then, a pinprick of light. Sirius. He doesn't cheer, he bows. Because this isn't just astronomy, this is cosmic choreography. The Nile will flood soon, as if summoned. Crops will grow. Life will restart. The goddess has kept her promise. The Great Pyramid reflects this celestial drama. Literally, one of its narrow shafts, rising from the Queen's chamber, points almost directly at the position of Sirius in the southern sky. Not by accident. That shaft wasn't made for breathing. It was made for seeing, or maybe even leaving. Some believe it served as a pathway, not just symbolic, but metaphysical, for the soul to rise and join the gods. Specifically, to join Osiris through the star that represents his wife, Isis. It's both love story and launch code. This alignment adds another layer to the pyramid's rollout, just as tomb, not just as compass, but as a clock. A sacred timer counting down to rebirth. The return of Sirius meant the return of life, of order, of Mot. Without that star, nothing worked. Not the seasons, not the rituals, not the afterlife. It's as if the universe had a password, and Sirius was the first letter. And think about this. They timed the calendar to a star. That's precision. The Egyptian year began with Sirius's rise. It marked the first day of the season of inundation, when the Nile would swell and pour its blessings across the land. The Egyptians didn't hope the flood would come. They knew. They knew because the sky told them. Because the sky was a clock and Sirius was the hour hand. Even more astonishing, Sirius's rise shifted over the centuries due to precession, but for much of ancient Egyptian history, it lined up almost perfectly with the summer solstice. So not only did they align their pyramids and temples with stars, they did so with an understanding of seasonal cycles, celestial movement, and sacred timing that we're still decoding today. And they didn't just observe it, they built around it. Temples to Isis often faced Sirius's rising point. Festivals were held in her honor, offerings made, songs sung, entire myths born out of that tiny flash of starlight. It's easy to forget, in the age of neon and notifications, how powerful one dot of light can be. But for them, that light was life. As you lie back again and try to find Sirius in your own night sky, it feels different now. Not just a star, but a signal. A promise made across millennia. That light touches you like it touched them. No translation needed. And it lingers, this thought. If the Egyptians built monuments to catch a star's rise, what else did they build to follow where it led? Somewhere between the heat of the day and the silence of midnight, the pyramid begins to feel like a sundial made of dreams. You walk along its edge and realize this isn't just geometry, it's choreography. A slow dance between light, shadow, and stone that has played out for thousands of years. And at the heart of this cosmic ballet, time. But not the ticking clock kind. The kind that moves in circles. Eternal, celestial, measured not in minutes, but in sunrises and star returns. The Great Pyramid isn't just a building, it's a calendar. And not a lazy one. This thing tracks solstices, equinoxes, and maybe even star cycles. The ancient Egyptians didn't just build a monument, they built a time machine, one that doesn't move you through time, but marks it, anchors it, makes it visible in the way shadows crawl across limestone at very specific moments in the year. Take the equinoxes. Twice a year, the sun rises due east and sets due west. On these days, if you're standing in the right spot at Giza, something magical happens. The pyramid casts no visible shadow on its eastern side at dawn. It glows, edge to edge, as if lit from within. And at sunset, the western face lights up just the same. That's not accidental. That's a reminder light, and dark in perfect balance. A stone echo of Ma'at itself. Then there's the solstices. In the summer, when the sun reaches its northernmost point, certain corners of the pyramid catch the first rays while others stay cold. Like the monument is choosing where time begins again. And in winter, the reverse. Light withdraws. Shadows grow long. But even then, the angles hold steady. The pyramid unfazed by season or storm. It's still watching, still pointing. Now add the stars back into the mix. Orion's belt rises and sets at predictable intervals. Sirius makes its heliacal entrance like a queen arriving fashionably late. And the circumpolar stars never leave the sky at all. The Egyptians had names for them, stories, rituals, but beneath all of it, a clock. And not just for the soul, for the land, for the people. Because every major event in their society, from harvest to coronation to burial, was timed with sky watching, the pyramid wasn't just for the pharaoh. It was for the entire civilization to remember when to plant, when to praise, when to mourn. It was a solar stellar metronome, ticking through generations, whispering, now, 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 now. Even the internal structure echoes this obsession with time. The sloped passages allow beams of sunlight or starlight to enter only during very specific times of year. It's as if the entire building was designed to wait for the right light. Not always, just sometimes, just when it mattered. And those moments, they were ceremonies. They were signs. Some researchers believe the pyramid could even be used to track the Sothic Cyclia 1,460-year period based on the drifting of Sirius's heliacal rising. That's not just impressive. That's generational astronomy. A knowledge passed like a family heirloom, encoded in architecture instead of scrolls. And when the stars shifted slightly, they didn't panic. They adapted, added temples, reoriented rituals. But the pyramid remained. You glance around now, and the shadows stretch long beside you. Not scary, just patient. Like the pyramid itself, waiting for the next alignment, the next light, the next second hand on this massive cosmic clock to tick forward. And suddenly, you understand something. To the Egyptians, immortality wasn't about never ending. It was about always returning, a cycle, a rebirth. Time not as a line, but as a loop. So when the pharaoh entered his tomb, he wasn't stepping into darkness. He was stepping into a circuit, one that would lead him right back here, again and again, through the stars, through the seasons, through the silent song of shadow and sun. And now, the question hangs in the cooling air. If this pyramid can track time, what else has it been silently counting all along? You could almost miss it, really. A shift in the air, a strange sense of space, a detail so easily dismissed, a narrow channel carved deep within the pyramid's heart. But this isn't a hallway. It doesn't lead to a burial chamber. It doesn't carry air, water, or offerings. It leads to nowhere. And yet, it points precisely to somewhere very specific in the sky. These aren't just shafts. They're sight lines, stargates, made of stone. Let's go inside. The passage is cramped, too tight to crawl through, yet perfectly cut, perfectly angled. It rises from the king's chamber and queen's chamber, both embedded deep within the pyramid, like the organs of a living body. At first glance, the shafts seem impractical. But if you trace them outward past the stone, through the desert night, they aim directly at the stars. One north shaft aligns with Thuban, the old North Star. The other, Orion's belt, southward, Sirius, and other key stars. It's like the pharaoh's soul had a personal flight path. And that's the fascinating part. These shafts weren't discovered until the 19th century. Hidden in plain stone, sealed from the inside. It took dynamite and robots to fully explore them. In 1993, a tiny rover called Upua-2 crawled through one of the Queen's chamber shafts and found a stone door with copper handles at the end. What's behind it? Another shaft? A hidden room? Maybe just more rock. Or maybe a message no one has decoded yet. These aren't random features. Their angles are too specific. Their alignment with stars too clean. This was intentional. And when you consider their size too small for any human use, you realize they were never meant for bodies. They were meant for souls. In Egyptian belief, the soul didn't just drift vaguely upward. It had destinations. The Ba, the part of the soul that could travel, needed guidance. These shafts, aimed at Orion and Sirius, weren't escape hatches. They were celestial runways. The king's spirit would ascend, pass through the door of the stars, and take its place among the gods. Maybe even become one. It gets better. Inside the pyramid texts, those beautifully carved spells found in later pyramids, there are instructions for the soul's journey. Lines like, "The doors of the sky are opened for you. The doors of the firmament are thrown open for you." The idea of the sky having doors isn't poetic fluff, it's literal. And these shafts? They're the architecture of that theology. Modern engineers have marveled at their construction. Narrow, perfectly angled, perfectly preserved. No error margins, no wobble, just silent precision. And that's what gets you. They went to all this effort for something no one would even see. Not in their time. Not for thousands of years. Why? Because the point wasn't public awe. It was alignment, intention, cosmic delivery. Imagine the moment they sealed the chamber for the last time. The light from a torch flickers against granite. Dust floats in the air. A priest places the final stone, speaks the final words, and everything goes silent. From then on, the only thing passing through those shafts would be starlight and maybe, if you believe in it, the soul of a king. You look up again, tracing Orion's faint belt with your finger. The same stars, the same path, thousands of years later, and the doorway still points true. It hasn't moved. And that's when the real question comes. Were these just passageways for the pharaoh? Or were they a signal, a beacon? Maybe they were sending something out. Or maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for something to come in. It's the kind of thing you could ignore if you weren't paying attention. A thin slit in a wall, barely wide enough for your arm, angled sharply toward nothing or so it seems. But stand in the right spot, at the right time, and that nothing becomes a star. The shaft in the king's chamber points not to a view, but to a destination, a fixed coordinate in the sky. The pyramid doesn't just rest on Earth, it reaches, very deliberately, into space. And here's where it gets wonderfully strange. What if these shafts weren't just symbolic? What if they were meant to transmit something? Not a soul, not a prayer, but a message. Imagine this. You're an ancient architect, entrusted with the eternal legacy of the king. You've measured stars by night and drawn diagrams by firelight. You don't think the sky is up. You think it's out. Not heaven above, but a realm beside ours, angled through time, tilted through space. So you design a tunnel not for people, but for communication. A cosmic fiber optic cable, except it's stone, and it points right at Orion. Some believe the shafts may have once held metal rods, perhaps part of a ritual function, or maybe something more mysterious. There's no definitive proof, just clues. Stone handles, sealed blocks, sudden bends. A deep sense that something's there, behind the wall, just out of reach. It almost feels like the pyramid is waiting for someone to knock back. And it's not just the shafts. The entire pyramid seems acoustically strange. Certain chambers echo oddly. Some frequencies hum longer than expected. Researchers have noted that sounds in the king's chamber resonate in ways modern buildings rarely replicate. That granite ceiling, it's not just heavy it rings, as if it's been tuned. Now this might sound wild, but ancient cultures often connected sound and stars. They believed the universe itself had a tone, the music of the spheres. Maybe the pyramid was designed not just to look at the stars, but to speak to them, through vibration, through alignment, through frequencies we haven't even begun to understand. Of course, mainstream archaeology urges caution. There's no known transmitter, no alien antenna, just incredibly precise stonework. But even the skeptics admit the shafts are real. The alignments are real. And the odds of those angles pointing randomly to Orion and Sirius? Slim. And let's not forget how the Egyptians viewed writing and communication. Their hieroglyphs weren't just symbols. They were living words. To speak a name was to keep a soul alive. To carve it in stone was to send it into eternity. So what happens when you align your entire building to the sky? When your pyramid becomes a kind of silent prayer, constantly aimed at the heavens? Maybe it's not a radio message. Maybe it's something older, something quieter, a resonance between stone and star, earth and sky. A standing wave in the geometry of space, echoing the pharaoh's name through time, not as sound, but as structure. And here you are, thousands of years later, standing exactly where someone once stood, looking in exactly the same direction. You see Orion. The stars haven't changed, and neither has the angle of that shaft. The message is still being sent. So the thought hits you, soft but sure. Maybe the pyramid never needed to speak out loud. Maybe the stone is the message, one that says, "We were here, we understood, and we aimed everything we had at the stars." Some stories aren't told with words. They're written in the way shadows fall, in how stones lean, in where a building chooses to look when the sky turns black. The ancient Egyptians didn't just worship gods, they mapped them. And if you start thinking of stars as divine coordinates, then the land becomes a canvas. The pyramids? Those were the pins marking where heaven touches earth. To the Egyptians, gods weren't abstract. They were somewhere. Osiris wasn't just a myth. He was Orion. Isis was Sirius. Horus was the rising sun. Nut, the sky goddess, arched above in a dome of starlight, and Geb, the earth god, lay beneath her. Their myths were cosmic, but also local. You didn't just pray to the sky. You walked through it, lived beside it, buried your dead under it, aligned, always to its pattern. So when they built a pyramid, they weren't just creating a tomb. They were building a god's landing site, a place where the divine might glance down and recognize a mirror of itself. Every angle, every elevation, every shaft wasn't just architectural, it was devotional, a cosmic welcome mat, and temples followed suit. Look at Dendera Edfu, Karnak. These weren't randomly oriented buildings. Their entrances faced the sunrise on specific feast days. Their sanctuaries echoed with star names. In Dendera, the ceiling is painted with a star map so vivid it still makes modern astronomers blink. There, Nut arches over the sky, swallowing the sun each night and birthing it again each dawn. Time wasn't just told, it was enacted. Even their cities carried celestial fingerprints. The layout of certain temples and causeways seemed to mimic constellations. The Osirion at Abydos sits low like the Duathi underworld, while nearby structures rise in tiers like the stars ascending into rebirth. It's not random. It's ritual architecture on a planetary scale. And when the pharaoh walked these places, he wasn't just a king. He was a god in training. Each ceremony, each alignment, Each building he passed through was another step in a star-bound initiation. To become Osiris in death, you had to reenact his journey in life. You had to physically walk the cosmos. This idea is woven deep into the pyramid texts. Over and over, the spells repeat. The sky is open to you. The stairway to the sky is set for you. Ascend, ascend. The pyramid wasn't a barrier between earth and heaven. It was a bridge. And the gods? They didn't just watch from above. They walked here. Their shadows stretched across the stone. Their feet echoed down the corridors. The architecture wasn't to impress humans. It was to host gods. Even the alignment with Orion and Sirius was more than astral admiration. It was imitation. Osiris died and rose. The pharaoh too must die and rise. And where do Orion and Sirius rise? Right there, in the eastern sky, at key times of year. So you build your tomb to face them. You orient your chambers to greet them. You whisper your name into the shaft, hoping it rides a starlight beam into Osiris's waiting arms. And maybe they believe no. Maybe they knew that if you copied heaven precisely enough, heaven might respond, might descend, might remember. Tonight, as you stand under this same sky, Orion pulsing faintly, Sirius just beyond the horizon, it feels like that hope never faded. The buildings remain, the angles hold, the names are still carved, faint but legible. And the gods? Maybe they're still walking, quietly, silently, in the rhythm between stars, in the space between shadows. You follow one line of stone with your hand, tracing its direction out into the dark. It points not at a building, not at a tree, but at the empty air where a star will rise in a few hours. And you think, maybe it isn't empty at all. Maybe that's where the gods went. And maybe they're still looking back. The desert doesn't just preserve stone, it preserves secrets. Beneath centuries of sandstorms and sun, the Giza Plateau has hidden more than it's revealed. For all we know about the pyramids, there's still a quiet, nagging truth no one can shake. We might have missed something big. Because these monuments weren't just built once and forgotten. They were revisited, rewritten, reburied, and sometimes redesigned to keep us guessing. Wind scours the surface daily, but what lies beneath? Ground-penetrating radar has shown anomalous strange voids beneath the pyramids, under the Sphinx, along the causeways. Tunnels with no clear purpose, chambers with no known entrance. It's as if the pyramid isn't a solid structure, but a puzzle box, designed not just to protect a body, but to protect knowledge. Layers of stone, layers of meaning. Take the shafts we've already seen angled perfectly toward Orion and Sirius. But recently, new voids have been found above the Grand Gallery, a space the size of a bus hidden for 4,500 years. No inscriptions, no air shafts, just silence. What's it for? A resonance chamber? A symbolic womb? A decoy to fool tomb robbers or truth seekers? And then there's the layout itself. The pyramids don't just mimic Orion's belt. They mimic the offset of Orion's belt. That tiny, almost careless slant in the third star, Menkora matches the offset in the third pyramid. It's not just alignment. It's mimicry with personality, precision with storytelling. Almost like the builders were saying, We see the sky, not just its shape, its nuance. But if this all sounds too clean, too mystical, just wait, because the sand holds contradictions. The earliest written records we have about the pyramids come from much later dynasties. There are no blueprints, no construction logs, no stone engraved with "Built by Khufu, Year 10, thanks team," just graffiti scrawled by work gangs on hidden stones and the legends of Herodotus Greek, not Egyptian. And that's where the mystery deepens. Some say the pyramids are older than we think, that Khufu didn't build them from scratch, but restored something more ancient, that their alignment with the sky of 10,500 BCE isn't coincidence, but legacy, inherited wisdom, or memory, or myth that fossilized into limestone. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest water damage not from rainfall today, but from floods thousands of years earlier, long before the Sahara became desert. Could the pyramids have roots in that forgotten age? A time when the Nile flowed differently, when the stars rose at new angles, when memory hadn't yet been reduced to sand? We don't know, and maybe we're not supposed to. The Egyptians weren't obsessed with giving answers. They were obsessed with preserving questions, with building structures that outlast explanation. Because mystery was sacred, and forgetting, that was death. So they buried their wisdom deep, in shadowy shafts, in star maps carved into ceilings, in ritual texts hidden so far inside tomb walls. It took us 3 millennia to find them, and still we haven't deciphered it all. Still the pyramids stand silent, sharp, waiting. You look out now over the desert, the wind cool on your cheek. There's nothing here but sand and stone. And yet, everything is here. A civilization's entire soul aimed upward, their knowledge encoded in shadow and symmetry. And underneath it all, that quiet question, soft as shifting dust. What haven't we found yet? You stand on a rise just beyond the Great Pyramid. Looking east, the desert stretches wide, golden and silent, the sky turning deep blue, stars winking on one by one. You trace Orion's belt again, out of habit now, like an ancient gesture passed down without knowing why. And then the thought hits you. They didn't build the pyramids to stay, they built them to go. To the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't an end. It was an itinerary, a journey across the sky, not metaphorically literally. The pyramid texts read like travel guides for the soul. Names to remember, gates to pass through, stars to follow. The pharaoh wouldn't drift into darkness. He would rise, reborn, through fire and starlight, navigating the heavens toward immortality. And the destination? The imperishable stars, the ones that never set, never fall below the horizon, circling the North Pole night after night. These weren't just bright dots, they were forever. Eternal companions in the sky, where Osiris ruled and Horus soared. To join them was to become untouchable. So they built stone staircases pointed directly toward the sky's eternal heart. Some passages in the pyramid text describe the soul transforming into a falcon, or a flame, or even a star itself. Others mention solar boats, celestial barges, that ferry the dead across the sky alongside Ra, the sun god. Imagine that. Not heaven as a static throne room, but as a voyage a cruise through constellations, powered by rituals and architecture and belief. And it wasn't only for pharaohs. Over time, this star-bound destiny expanded. Middle Kingdom texts show common people beginning to share in this cosmology. Tomb ceilings painted with star maps, sarcophagi lined with protective spells. The journey to Orion, to Sirius, to the circumpolar starset became a collective dream. You step closer to the pyramid shadow, and it swallows you for a second. The stone feels cold, solid, certain. It was built for the long haul, a structure that could withstand sand, storms, thieves, even forgetfulness, and still it points upward, still reaching. And the pyramid's orientation tells you it was never meant to just lie still. Those chambers, shafts, corridors, they're all motion, all transition. A stone cocoon for something meant to ascend. The pharaoh enters as a man, exits as a star. That's the promise. Modern minds struggle with that, of course. We want blueprints, evidence. But maybe the ancient Egyptians didn't need to see it work. Maybe they believed that believing was part of the mechanism. That when you shape stone with purpose, when you align it with stars and seasons, you build reality. And maybe they weren't wrong. After all, the pyramid's still here. The stars it points to still shine. And we, thousands of years later, still ask the same questions. Where do we go? What are we part of? What lasts? So maybe that's what the pyramids were meant to be, not destinations, but launch pads. Not monuments to what was, but monuments to what could be. You die, you rise, you travel, you shine. And standing here, under the same stars, beside the same stones, you feel it not fear, not sadness, but something deeper, a kind of calm, a certainty that the journey doesn't end, that somewhere beyond Orion, someone's still traveling. And maybe, just maybe, they're looking back. You walk one last quiet loop around the pyramid, the sand cool now, the air almost still. Behind you, the massive stone silhouette stands like a sleeping god. Above you, Orion gleams those 3 stars as sharp and steady as ever. You stop, breathe, and realize they never stop pointing at each other, the stone and the stars, like an eternal nod of recognition. The Egyptians called it Akthat, brilliant, transfigured soul that glowed in the afterlife like a star. Not ghostly, not shadowy, but radiant. It wasn't enough to be remembered. You had to shine. And so they built monuments not to hold a body, but to create a transformation. Not just escape death, but to rewrite it. Everything about the pyramid was part of that process. The stone didn't seal the soul in it, launched it out. The precise alignment, the shafts, the inscriptions, the rituals, the star-shaped path. These weren't superstition. They were instructions, mechanisms, like a recipe for rebirth. You weren't supposed to rest in peace. You were supposed to ignite. And maybe that's the final wonder of all this, that people without computers or satellites or smartphones looked up at the sky, saw patterns, and said, let's talk to it. Let's answer it. Let's build something so big, so specific, so deliberate, that even after thousands of years it still whispers to the stars. The pyramids weren't built to last. They were built to continue, not as relics, but as signals. The pharaoh's name, carved inside, wasn't just an identity. It was a frequency, a call sign sent through space. Not metaphor, not myth, maybe something we just don't have the tools to decode anymore. And they trusted us future humans to eventually look up from our busy little cities and blinking screens and notice, to wonder, to listen, to ask, what were they aiming for? And what might we aim for if we dared? So maybe that's what you carry with you now, as you step away from the sand, the stars still glimmering over your shoulder. Not just facts about a monument, but a feeling that the sky is still listening, that ancient stones still point, and that the journey they began, the one through stars and meaning and time and ever, actually ended. It's still happening. And now, you're part of it. So now, let the stars dim gently in your mind. The golden sand fades into softness. The giant stones dissolve into quiet. You're no longer standing beneath a pyramid or tracing the angles of Orion. You're floating, weightless, somewhere between memory and myth. The journey tonight wasn't just through history. It was through wonder, through questions too old for answers, and structures too perfect to forget. Let your breath slow. Let the rhythm of ancient times settle into your chest. Maybe you're still feeling the hush of the desert wind or the stillness of a priest watching a single star blink into dawn. Maybe you're imagining your name whispered into a starlit shaft, riding light forever. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to build a pyramid to be remembered. You just have to look up, be curious, and wonder what's still waiting to be discovered in the silence. Now, close your eyes. Let the stone rest. Let the sky fold around you like Nut, the sky goddess herself, arms wrapped over earth. And as you drift into sleep, remember, even in the quiet, the stars are still watching, still whispering, still shining for you.